It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. The U.S. may have committed its worst bombing of Iraqi civilians since the 2003 invasion. A recent airstrike in Mosul is said to have killed more than 200 people and flattened an entire block. The attack comes as part of the U.S.-backed offensive to retake West Mosul from ISIS. There is speculation the Trump administration has eased restrictions on airstrikes to intensify the anti-ISIS campaign in Iraq and Syria. The website Air Wars reports the U.S. bombings may now be killing more civilians than Russia has in Syria. The fighting in western Mosul has forced tens of thousands of people to flee their homes. Joining us to discuss the latest is Saba Al-Nasri, Associate Professor at York University in Toronto. Professor, welcome.
Hi, Aaron.
What can you tell us so far about this deadly strike? We know it happened on March 17th, but only coming to light weeks later with reports that this is the worst airstrike by the U.S. since they invaded 14 years ago.
That's true. The conservative estimate was 230 civilians were killed in this building. Of course, at the beginning, the Iraqi Defense Ministry and the U.S. tried to accuse ISIS or terrorists to be behind the killing of civilians, but it's not true. There are a lot of evidence within Iraq that shows clearly that this was a hit by the U.S. Or the coalition airstrikes, but this is just a small number of the civilian killed in Iraq since January this year. Ever since Trump came to power, we see a trend of escalating the conflict in Iraq, in Syria, in Somalia, in Yemen, etc. So since January until yesterday, more than 4,000 Iraqi civilians were killed. And I was counting on the Iraqi body count, which is also a conservative estimate of the figure. Almost 1,100 civilians were killed in Mosul since January. And again, this is really a conservative estimate. And the UN has even less numbers, more conservative. They downplay the civilian casualties in Iraq for different reasons. And the most insidious thing about the killing of civilians in Mosul and other parts in Iraq or in Yemen, etc., is the argument that those who embed themselves with the civilian people, terrorist organization ISIS, who use people as human shields, are responsible for the death, as if not the bombing, the U.S. bombing that killed the people, but those who embed or use them as a human shield. Even the United Nations used such an insidious argument, which is a way of justifying the killing of civilians. Now, this, as I said, this is a trend since the new president came to power, January 20th. We can see the escalation of conflicts in Yemen, in Somalia, in Syria, and Iraq. And a lot of civilians were killed in Yemen in January, at the end of January, in Syria, just before the incident happened in Mosul. And we see that at the same time, there are two scary developments here. The first one is the Trump administration declared 3 provinces of Yemen to be area of hostile activity, which means a classical war zone, and euphemism for targeting civilians and killing them, or committing war crime with impunities. Because if you declare them as war zones or areas of hostile activities, you argue that the so-called rule of engagement are not applied or barely applied there. So this is the first scary development. The second one is not only in Yemen but also in Somalia. There's also the attempt of the Trump administration to declare part of Somalia as to be a war zone or area of active hostilities. And again, here civilians will be attacked with impunities. So we are talking about war crimes that are repeated again and again. And it seems to me that in the meantime, any administration in the U.S. they tend to accept that they committed these strikes, but they don't characterize them as a crime, as if by accepting them they can clean their hand from these atrocities. And this is really a scary development, since January. I mean, we have this under Obama administration, but there was some restriction in the Obama administration how to use the so-called rule of engagement. Now, under the Trump administration, you have a very loosened battlefields rules that barely apply, and we would expect that a lot of civilian people would be killed in the next few weeks and months.
You know, back to Iraq, the siege, the attempt to retake Mosul is coming against a majority Sunni city, and it recalls previous U.S. attempts to bombard Sunni cities. I'm thinking about Ramadi and Fallujah. Now, both of these attacks were very, very deadly, and they also helped give rise, actually, to ISIS.
Yes.
So now what I'm wondering is, in this attempt to drive ISIS from a majority Sunni city again, whether the ferocity of this campaign, just like Ramadi and Fallujah, may actually, even if ISIS loses Western Mosul, which it looks like it will, could actually ultimately help strengthen ISIS or a similar extremist group in the long term for the same reasons that it did in Ramadi and Fallujah. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's what I meant by it's, you know, the statement that they will lose the rule of engagement. It sounds like a warning, like a threat, because the more civilian you kill, the more people get outraged and traumatized, and the more radicalized they get, and the more, you know, young people would be willing to carry weapons and to act in a violent way instead of solving their problem politically. So de facto, you're creating more extremist group, more insecurities, and more, you know, acts of terror, which defeats the purpose. Now, when President Trump claims that he wants to win wars, he wants to eliminate ISIS, that means he will escalate the bombing of these cities, and the number of the civilian death will skyrocket, which like a self-fulfilling prophecy, you create more terrorists through your policies than actually winning the war or trying to achieve any sort of settlement or stability in the region.
At the same time, we should note that there have been areas of Mosul that have been liberated, and the citizens there have seemed very, very grateful to have seen ISIS dislodged.
Not quite. You know, I wouldn't use the term liberating, because if you look at Mosul, Fallujah, Ramadi, and Tikrit, and so on, these are ghost cities, ruins. 100,000 people were displaced. They can't even go back home for the next few years. So yes, they are happy that they are not under the atrocity of ISIS, but at the same time, they face atrocities from different sector of the Iraqi military or militias or anti-terrorist groups who suspect that these people either were supporter or sympathizer or even members of ISIS. And that's why we shouldn't take what people say who flee these cities at face value. Like when people say we were used as human shield, they must say this, because otherwise Iraqi army or the militias would suspect that they are sympathizers of ISIS. So to rescue themselves from further atrocities, they claim that they were, you know, used as human shield, etc. That's why I wouldn't say liberating, because, you know, these cities with millions of inhabitants, historically, you know, dense areas, any attempt to take these cities with violence or with bombing and strike would mean taking a higher death toll of civilian and accepting it as collateral, which again, I mean, if you compare the civilian death in Mosul to the number of ISIS there, it is ridiculous. You know, maybe 3-4 times more civilians were killed compared to the number of ISIS fighters in the city. So this is anything but victory or liberation.
What is the alternative, though, if ISIS is controlling Mosul and they're deeply embedding themselves in the population? What's the answer? How can they be taken out?
Well, the answer was, I said this years ago on the Real News. The way ISIS occupied Mosul in 2014 was very characteristic for the corrupt Iraqi state. You know, the army, the security forces, they didn't defend the city. They just left the city for ISIS fighters to take it over. Because these militias, who are mostly, you know, members of the Shiite party, they didn't really care about these cities in the western and northwestern part of Iraq, thinking that they are Sunnis or whatever. So this ethnic sectarian worldview, this myopic worldview, is the reason why these cities were occupied by ISIS in the first place. And again, people in Mosul, especially officers, generals, soldiers of the dissolved Iraqi army, where they could have liberated the city if they sensed that this government, the Iraqi government, was sincere about reconciliation, was sincere about equal treatment of different groups in Iraq, was sincere about bringing social justice, economic development, etc. in these cities. But they were not. They didn't sense it. And they were saying if there was a serious attempt by the Iraqi government and al-Maliki or later and al-Abadi to reconcile, etc., they would have gotten rid of ISIS within a week or two, just like they did before with Al-Qaeda. But they didn't sense, ever since these Shiite / Kurdish parties govern in Iraq, any sincere attempt by this government to reconcile with these marginalized segment of the Iraqi population. So again, the problem could have been solved politically. People in Mosul them said they could have got rid of ISIS in a short period of time, and you would have had a completely different development since a few years. But that was not attended, that was not wanted neither by the Iraqi government nor by the US. Just to give you an example, when this attack on March 17th happened and 250 people were killed, the defense ministry first accused ISIS of committing the crime. And then it was silenced for 2 days until there was a pressure from the parliament and the speaker of the parliament to initiate an investigation. Only then the defense ministry started investigating this incident. That shows us that there is, a complicity of part of the security apparatus of Iraq with the U.S. Against the civilian population in Iraq.
Okay, so you've identified the key critique of the Iraqi government over the previous years, which is that it's sectarian, favors Shiites over, and has marginalized Sunnis. But there does seem to be some involvement of Sunni militias in this Mosul offensive, and some claim that the role of Shiite militias has been sidelined. Shiites, in some cases, not allowed to enter certain areas. Is that not a potential sign of advancement on the Iraqi government's part when it comes to addressing the concerns of Sunnis and involving them in the country's politics?
Well, two things here. The first one is Mosul is an important province for Turkey, and you have Turkish troops and military base near Mosul. So the Iraqi government knew exactly that if the Shiite militias would enter Mosul, that means they would probably face a war with Turkey. And because there's a huge Turkmenian minorities in Mosul from Turkish origins, Arab from Turkish origins. So Turkey is very much interested in this part of Iraq. So to avoid conflict with Turkey, of course, they kept the Shiite militia outside of Mosul on the western route outside the city that cut off the logistic support for ISIS from Syria. The second thing is that these so-called Sunni tribal forces, these are mostly forces that are allies of the Shiite parties who benefited from the Iraqi government against other Sunni tribes who are against the government. So the Iraqi government is engaging in divide and rule by separating the good Sunni tribes that collaborate with them and the bad one who oppose them. So again, this is anything but a right path to reconciliate and create a homogeneous, unified Iraq. It is, at the end of the day, the governing parties, be them Kurds or Shiites, what they're doing, they're pursuing their own particular interests, and they divide and rule and play out different Iraqi population against each other to sustain their power. This is a dead-end policy.
So then the alternative to a campaign that involves U.S.-led bombings that kill a lot of people, plus a sectarian-driven offensive, or at least sectarian-influenced offensive, would be then to empower more Sunni militias and halt the strikes from the air? Is that what would be your prescription for how to conduct this Mosul offensive in a more humane and effective way?
Right. I mean, The U.S. has an enormous leverage on the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government depends on the U.S. to stay in power. It's obvious. So if the U.S. government is sincere about solving the conflict in Iraq and defeating ISIS and bringing some sort of stability and order in Iraq, they could use their leverage vis-a-vis the Iraqi government and pressure the Iraqi government to substantively initiate approaches to reconcile with a different segment of the Iraqi population that are alienated up until today, and let the people themselves in these cities, once they sense they are accepted on the same term, they are included in all kind of social, economic, whatever political developments of Iraq, they would get organized and they would get rid of ISIS in Mosul or other parts of Iraq, just like they did in 2007, by the way, when the U.S., at that time, General Petraeus supported some Sunni militias, so-called Al-Sahwa, to get rid of Al-Qaeda, which they did within a few weeks. So that means at that time, because they sensed there was a sincere, some sort of approach to reconcile. But then it turned out to be, it was a fake approach that led to nothing, actually. And so there is no sense among a big segment of the Iraqi population, by the way, not only the Sunni, other parts of the Iraqi population, that this government is capable and willing of reconciliating and engaging in some sort of national unified development in Iraq. I mean, the governing parties in Iraq, the Shiite and Kurds, are so provincial, so myopic in their worldview, so interested in particular interests in staying in power, that this trumps every social, economic, political initiative to reconcile with the rest of the Iraqi population. So you need a radical, not only institutional, but structural reform within Iraq. And I think the U.S. has an enormous leverage if the U.S. is interested in having stabilities and peace in Iraq and defeating ISIS. It's not through bombing and more killing, quite the opposite, through political, economic, and diplomatic institutional reforms and pressure. This is the only way out of this vicious and virtuous circle.
Finally, just taking a broader regional view, I'm wondering if you think that if it's true that the Trump administration is escalating its operations in Iraq and Syria and Yemen, and certainly the rising civilian toll would indicate that it is, if that has any implications for the ongoing Russian and Iranian campaign inside Syria, which also has killed many civilians.
Yes, that's true. The problem is, as I said, all these regional and global players, not only the US, look at, for instance, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, and so on. All of them are interested in gaining some territorial capital, some political capital on the ground for future negotiation, because all of them are interested in having their influence secured, reproduced in the future development in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, etc. So there is no sincere attempt to find a peaceful solution. When the U.S. made some concession to Russia and etc. to negotiate with the Syrian opposition and the Syrian government, at the same time they intensified military conflicts on the ground and created new allies like the YPGs. Now this, of course, will create a conflict with Turkey, because Turkey considers the Turkish forces, the YPGs, as a terrorist organization. U.S. used them, utilized them against not only ISIS, but against even sometimes, the Assad government. So that means all of them are engaging in war of attrition, instabilities in the long term, and none of them is really interested in making peace. And this is, that's what I have termed long ago. The new world order is a new war order. It's a permanent war. And I think the U.S., and this is per design, this is, for the U.S., is the most effective strategy in sustaining dominance due to the lack of alternative economic, political, whatever development due to the crisis. They will sustain this militarized war of terror, not war on terror, but war of terror, as long as they can. So that means the alternative is to pressure Iraqi government or whatever governments in the region to change their policies. And the American people, they need to pressure their government and especially the military apparatus to change their policies radically if they are really interested in creating peace. I mean, for me, it's not a coincidence that at the same time, the Trump administration, issued two executive immigration and so on ban on these countries where they precisely are engaging in most intensified, civilian killings. Another way, they are telling these refugees from these countries not to come to the U.S., to stay in Yemen, in Somalia, in Sudan, in Iraq, etc., in Syria, to be killed by U.S. airstrikes. This is a different form of population control.
Professor Saba Al-Nasri of York University in Toronto, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.